Chosen one, let's get one thing straight right now. You're not average, and your story was never meant to unfold like anyone else's. You weren't built to blend in. You weren't sent here to be small. You carry something rare, something that unsettles the insecure and awakens the discerning. That's why the whispers started. That's why they tried to twist your image. Because deep down, even they sensed it. There's something on you that can't be explained, only recognized. And guess what? You don't need to defend it. You don't need to shrink to make others comfortable. You are the evidence. You are the shift. You are the one they didn't see coming. So welcome to the arena, chosen one. Stand tall. This is your confirmation that no lie, no slander, no sabotage can outrun the truth stamped on your name. Let them watch. You were born for this. They underestimated the weight of their whispers, gambling with influence they couldn't measure. This wasn't an idle complaint or a harmless vent. It was a calculated risk spoken in the ear of someone with perception sharp enough to feel the dissonance before the words finished forming. The one they tried to turn now sees everything clearly, not because of argument or persuasion, but because of a quiet unfolding of truth. What was meant to defame became a spotlight, not on the one accused, but on the insecurities of the one speaking. Now there's a silence between them, not born of misunderstanding, but of the liar's own realization. They misread the room, and the cost of that misstep echoes louder than the words they once thought were so clever. Looking for purpose and peace? Hit subscribe and start the journey. They mistook a silent witness for an easy mark, unaware that some people carry quiet discernment like a blade. While they smiled on the surface, something deeper was listening, and it noticed every crack in the story, every twist that didn't align. What was supposed to be a character assassination turned into an unintentional confession. Now, the one they tried to sway watches with wiser eyes, no longer influenced but observant. And the storyteller, once so bold, avoids the scene, not out of remorse, but dread. Dread that their fiction has been unmasked. Dread that the consequences they never calculated are already unfolding beyond their control. What was whispered in falsehood has begun to echo in consequences. It wasn't just a distortion of facts, it was a revealing of self. The truth didn't need defense. It unfolded in consistent behavior, in the way growth contradicted accusation. They assumed they could orchestrate perception, but ended up revealing their own fragility. The person who listened now understands more than they were ever meant to, and the one who lied is left staring at a distance they created, haunted not by what was said, but by how clearly they've been seen. They weren't cast into a villain's role. They walked into it, thinking it would shield them. The test wasn't obvious, and the moment didn't announce itself. But in choosing ego over integrity, they unraveled their own thread. What seemed like a quick detour into gossip was actually a fork in their own story. Their reaction wasn't random. It was a response to an internal conflict they refused to face. In that moment, they revealed what was hidden and failed a test disguised as a person. Step beyond the screen. Join and help light the way for others. Not everyone enters your life to be comfort. Some arrive to reflect. And when a mirror appears, it shows not just what's on the surface, but what lies beneath. Instead of seeking healing, they sought control. Your steadiness was mistaken for arrogance, your stillness for superiority. But that reaction wasn't about you. It was about what they weren't ready to confront in themselves. And when their own reflection became too uncomfortable, they tried to distort yours. But alignment doesn't bend to rumor, And the real test was never how they treated you at your best, but how they responded when you were unguarded, human, and becoming. Envy rarely introduces itself plainly. It often wraps itself in false warmth. That's how their disguised resentment slipped into the ears of someone who wasn't meant to receive it. But the outcome was not what they had planned. Instead of drawing suspicion toward you, they unveiled their own unrest. The moment they tried to mask their insecurity as worry, the illusion fractured. It wasn't just a careless slip, it was a full revelation of intent. That conversation, meant to plant seeds of doubt, only ended up showing how far they were from the strength they pretended to hold. Now, there's distance, not just physical, but energetic, because the fallout of their choice is something they can't talk their way out of. The silence between you carries more weight than confrontation ever could. They didn't anticipate that their words would become part of a deeper reckoning. They thought passing off distortion as concern would dissolve into nothingness. But intentions leave fingerprints, and the moment they spun their version of the story, something began recording, not in a file or a note, but in a place they can't erase. It was never just about the words. It was about the motive behind them. They set a trap that didn't catch anyone but themselves. The narrative they created is now standing as quiet testimony, not because someone exposed them, but because their own energy did. If your heart overflows with divine love, now is the moment to let it shine. Click the super thank you button on YouTube and give $50 or more to help carry God's light to others. Your gift will bless not only your life, but countless others. You are part of His sacred plan. Your kindness may be the answer to someone's prayer. Share your blessings and honor His kingdom. May His grace guide you always. They believed they were simply talking. In truth, they were revealing. What they said became a silent marker in time, signaling the point where their true motivation cracked through the surface. And the one who listened may not have said much then, but they felt every disconnect. The tone didn't match the message. The pauses spoke louder than the accusations. Now, those inconsistencies are being replayed in the listener's mind, not as rumors, but as red flags. What was intended to discredit you is now unraveling slowly, not by confrontation, but by the steady contrast between their story and your reality. The one who received the false version of your story was never random. They were aligned with your path for a reason, not to break trust, but to witness the truth. What was meant to push them away from you only pulled them closer. The liar underestimated the power of alignment, assuming that influence could be manipulated with a few sly remarks. But what they revealed instead was their own erosion, the fear, the competition, the inability to stand in someone else's light without trying to dim it. That moment of attempted sabotage triggered a shift they never predicted. It awakened a kind of awareness in the listener. What they expected to cause harm instead opened eyes. Now, without confrontation, a quiet protection surrounds you. The one who was meant to believe the worst now observes the best and guards it. There's no dramatic fallout, no grand announcement, just a subtle, unspoken redirection. Where poison was poured, clarity grew. And while no public lines have been drawn, the energy has shifted permanently. It wasn't just a misstep, it was a revelation. When they spoke, they didn't realize the words would carry a different weight, not because of what was said, but because of what was sensed. They weren't giving a warning. They were releasing pressure from emotions too heavy to hide. It was framed as care, but the undertones betrayed them. The pauses between their sentences held more than thought. They carried suppressed comparisons, quiet envy, and a longing to feel superior. The listener caught it, not through facts, but through imbalance. The image they painted didn't align with the energy they radiated. And in that moment, the curtain lifted, not on you, but on them. There was a fracture in the performance, a gap between what they said and what could be felt. Something in their voice betrayed their polish. The harder they tried to sound noble, the more it slipped. What was meant to be an accusation, cloaked in kindness, became a reflection of their own discomfort. The person on the receiving end didn't nod because they believed. It was because they were already searching for the cracks. They could feel something wasn't sincere. No real concern carries that much tension. No genuine care twists details into distorted shapes. And when the performance ended, what lingered was not a message, but a motive. The discomfort now isn't coming from being caught. It's from the tension of what's unspoken. They don't fear your reaction. They fear your presence. They fear what happens when proximity reveals contrast. Not because you'll expose them, but because they've already exposed themselves, and now any closeness threatens to illuminate the truth they tried to hide. There's nothing more unsettling than being in the same room with what you pretended wasn't real. And now, they can't stand in your space without everything they denied showing up beside you, uninvited but undeniable. Step beyond the screen. Join and help light the way for others. What unsettles them most is how little effort it takes from you to reveal everything. You don't explain. You don't correct. You just live, and that alone becomes the unraveling. Not through speeches or rebuttals, but through clarity, the kind that makes lies lose their shape. Your groundedness is disruptive to anything built on illusion, and that disruption is what they fear. Not your voice, but your stillness. Not confrontation, but presence. Every time your name is mentioned, it stirs something they can't silence because it reminds them that the truth doesn't need volume to echo. They hoped their words would dissolve with time, that memories would blur and consequences would fade. But instead of hiding what they did, time revealed what you became. Growth became your response, evolution your rebuttal. And now, the very contrast they tried to prevent is what exposes the gap between what was said and what is. They avoid you not because it's over, but because it never will be, for them. The tension isn't in what you did, it's in what they fabricated and how clearly the illusion crumbles in your quiet. Some people forget that not every listener is simple. Some are portals of perception. When the story was spun with subtle distortions, it wasn't dropped into the lap of someone passive. It landed with someone whose awareness stretches far beyond spoken words. The delivery was dressed in cleverness, polished just enough to pass for honesty, but it didn't land the way they hoped. Beneath the script and smiles, the vibration didn't match the vocabulary. They underestimated the insight of the one hearing it. This wasn't someone led by flattery or surface logic. They heard beneath the words, into the intention, and the entire performance cracked right there in silence. If your heart overflows with divine love, now is the moment to let it shine. Click the super thank you button on YouTube and give $50 or more to help carry God's light to others. Your gift will bless not only your life, but countless others. You are part of His sacred plan. Your kindness may be the answer to someone's prayer. Share your blessings and honor His kingdom. May His grace guide you always. The change wasn't loud, but it was seismic. The moment that tale left their lips, a quiet wall went up. Trust didn't erode gradually, it collapsed inward. The listener didn't call it out, didn't challenge it openly, but they clocked everything. The mismatch between the story and the storyteller didn't need confirmation. It was already felt. What was meant to cast shadows only pulled back a veil, exposing not the target, but the speaker. They weren't whispering into the ears of someone naive. They were trying to mislead a compass calibrated by something higher, and it failed. The reaction was quiet, but the consequences were precise. The listener didn't just drift, they redirected. What they once offered in connection began flowing elsewhere. The one who twisted the truth began to feel something was off. Replies slower, space colder, support missing. But they can't trace the moment they lost favor because they never noticed when they revealed themselves. What they don't realize is that they triggered something sacred. Their lie didn't just miss its mark, it rewired the atmosphere, pulling protection away from them and placing it where it belonged. And now, without announcement, they are being kept at a distance by the very person they tried to turn. What once gave them a sense of power now pins them in place. The narrative they crafted sits on their shoulders like a weight they can't shrug off. If they were to approach you again, they'd have to face the space they created and admit that none of it was real. But ego won't let them unravel what they built. They remember the version of themselves they sold and know they can't walk back in, wearing a different face without being questioned. Silence has become their shield, but also their sentence. That distance is no longer strategy, it's a symptom. To come back would mean undoing the performance, pulling out every false thread, and standing exposed in the aftermath. But that would require more courage than they've ever shown. So they linger in avoidance, locked in a space they claimed to control. Not because they've moved on, but because they're afraid to move closer. They fear what your presence might do to the illusion, not because you'll speak, but because the truth hums too loudly when you're near, and their pride is too fragile to withstand the noise. What they didn't expect was for your journey to speak louder than any explanation. While they quietly bet on your unraveling, life had other plans. They were counting on your setbacks to justify their distortions, believed your stillness was submission, your silence was surrender. But as you kept unfolding, not with noise, but with steady becoming, everything they claimed began to lose weight. Without needing to defend or declare, you advanced, not dramatically, but undeniably. And that's when the tide turned. What they labeled as weakness became undeniable evidence of strength. Every step you took forward left a crack in the false version they crafted. The unraveling wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, slow, and unmistakable. Not because you fought back, but because you evolved in plain sight. And now, standing near you comes with consequence. Being close reminds them of the gap between the story they told and the truth you live. That discomfort they carry around you isn't distance born of maturity. It's a reaction to the clarity you radiate. You didn't just survive the lie. They're haunted by the fact that your growth dismantled it without ever needing a single rebuttal. Your consistency made their words irrelevant. And now, being in your presence makes it impossible to pretend they weren't wrong. They believed their version of events would remain unchallenged. But the very people they tried to sway now observe the contrast. What was once whispered is now questioned. They avoid being near you not out of resolve, but because standing beside you makes the truth impossible to hide. You didn't disprove them. They exposed themselves, and every moment you continue thriving makes it harder for them to maintain the illusion they tried to create. Their story is eroding under the weight of your reality, and every milestone you cross deepens the divide they tried to blur. In trying to undermine you, They accidentally removed themselves from your orbit. It wasn't a punishment, it was a realignment. What they thought was harmless manipulation became a severing thread. And that detachment wasn't authored by bitterness, it was directed by something higher. They crossed an invisible line, not realizing that twisting truth around someone guided by purpose carries consequences not just in this world, but beyond it. The disconnect they feel now isn't circumstantial, it's intentional. Access was revoked not by you, but by the divine rhythm that governs alignment. Now they find themselves locked out, not because you slammed a door, but because their own words turned the key. They feel the walls, but can't explain them. Conversations falter. Connections they once leaned on no longer flow. And no matter how they try to step back into your atmosphere, the energy won't let them land. That resistance isn't random. It's a protection set in motion the moment they chose to twist what was true. And until truth is chosen over ego, that wall remains unmoved. They didn't just invent a story, they built a barrier. And now the only way back requires something they're not ready to give: admission. The cost of re-entry is honesty, not apology coated in performance, but truth, the kind that strips pride to its roots. And without it, they'll stay outside, watching what they tried to silence grow into something sacred, not because they're unwelcome, but because falsehood has no access to what is real. Some people underestimate who's watching. They assumed they were spinning a harmless version of events, polishing the narrative just enough to lean in their favor. What they failed to see was that the person they were speaking to wasn't just casually present. They were placed with purpose, not just to hear, but to remember, not just to absorb the surface, but to recognize the undercurrent. The deception wasn't missed, it was noted. And the one who received it wasn't a participant in gossip. They were a witness, being prepared to recall, reflect, and later recognize the truth, in contrast to the falsehood. That listener didn't argue or react. They stored it quietly, holding it against what came after. Your actions, your walk, your consistency, all began to tell a different story. And as your life continued to open with grace and stability, the words spoken against you began to look smaller, less believable. That witness started to compare the two timelines, the version they were told and the reality they saw unfolding. And without a single correction from you, they began to understand. The falsehood they were fed couldn't stand next to the clarity of your truth. No confrontation followed, only distance. No loud judgment, just a quiet withdrawal. The same person who once listened now begins to drift from the one who twisted the facts. Your life became a reflection they couldn't deny. They no longer needed an explanation. They had evidence. Without trying, you became the correction. And the person who once tried to reroute your story now watches their influence dissolve, not from conflict, but from clarity. You were never required to defend what was already ordained. Your path was built to confirm itself in time, and time did the work. The more you evolved, the more the lies decayed. The one who tried to cast you in the wrong light now sits in silence, observing how that light continues to shine, untouched by their edits. They misjudged their power in your story, thought they could shape how others viewed you, not realizing that what's real always reclaims its form. In trying to erase you, they erased themselves. They spoke, and in doing so, severed the very connection that once included them in your future. What they thought was a moment of control became the moment of exit. They didn't just step away, they were removed, not by force, but by order. Something sacred corrected the balance, not to punish, but to protect what's purposeful. Now they occupy a strange space, near enough to see, too far to return. They didn't just close a chapter, they were written out. What they set in motion wasn't an ending for you, but an invitation for your next level. Meanwhile, they sit on the sidelines of a story they were never meant to rewrite. What remains is the weight of a decision they can't undo, and the view of a life still rising without them. No one pushed them out. They exited through the very door they tried to lock behind you, and now they stand where spectators do, watching the unfolding, not as part of it, but as proof that alignment will always correct what ego tries to distort. Some exits don't come from doors closing naturally. They're the result of people walking themselves out of stories they were once written into. It's one thing to drift apart by time or distance, but it cuts deeper when someone realizes they are absent because of their own actions. And now, every chapter you turn without them echoes a truth they can't ignore. They were part of the blueprint, but chose to tear themselves away before the masterpiece was even visible. There's no going back now, not because you locked them out, but because their own deception sealed the way shut. And the silence left behind is louder than any goodbye. They aimed at your character, thinking no one would notice, assumed you were an easy target, too quiet to cause a stir, too composed to fight dirty. They believed their version of you would stand because you wouldn't contest it. Thought that the absence of your protest would make their version stick. But what they didn't calculate was that silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's strategy. And in your stillness, something greater was listening. There was someone meant to witness, not the drama, but the truth beneath it. Not the noise, but the alignment. While they were busy sowing falsehoods, another was watching with deeper awareness, not guided by opinion, but by insight. That person didn't challenge the lie outright. They didn't need to. They saw the contrast between your steadiness and the chaos and made their own quiet decisions. And in doing so, they stepped out of the slander and into clarity, not as a defender by title, but as someone who couldn't ignore what their spirit was sensing.